And today we are joined by Bob Leavitt. Bob was a project manager for a software development company in Lincoln, Nebraska before he and his wife Connie retired and moved to Estes Park in 2014. They bought a house in 2010 but moved here full-time in 2014. As a kid, Bob vacationed here in the 1950s and 60s, staying in one of the cabins near Meeker Park Lodge and hiking all over Rocky Mountain National Park. Later, Bob and Connie brought their own kids to Estes Park in the 80s and 90s, so they've had a long-term connection with Estes Park and the Colorado Mountains. Bob began researching his own family history in the 1980s, which led to a broader interest in the history and places where his ancestors had lived. Although none of his ancestors have lived in Colorado, Colorado and Estes Park truly have a rich history. And after moving here, he was fascinated with the local history, and this motivated him to do some of his own local history research. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining today. I guess the next thing I need to do is share my screen, right?
And then I'll mute myself and turn off my video.
Okay.
So I'm out of your way. And then apparently we don't have a chat box today, guys, but if you do want to raise your hands to ask Bob a question, there's the raise your hand feature down on the bottom of the screen. And I'll be monitoring that too. So jump in anytime.
Okay, it's blinking away here. I just need to get things connected and start the slideshow. Okay, there we go. All right, well, this is a program on researching the life of James McLaughlin and what turns out to be the second ranch in the Estes Valley. So I started this research, actually I started looking at the history of Carriage Hills in general. And I thought, you know, in the beginning I could just start when it became a subdivision in the 1960s and then kind of go from there. But then I started asking questions like who owned this land, who lived here first, you know, how did it all get started? And so I realized very quickly that I needed to expand my focus in the time and geography beyond my initial scope. Also, let's see. I just want to ask, are these kind of over part of the page here, my video? Let me move it up like that. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Anyway, one day I was talking to Jim Pickering, our local historian laureate, and he said there was a ranch, early ranch in the Carriage Hills area. And I thought, are you sure? And he said, yeah, I think so. And he even kind of pointed out in general where he thought it would be. And so further research, started looking into this and discovered that that ranch was run by and owned by James McLaughlin. So today's program focuses on a very early resident of the Estes Valley, James McLaughlin. I do want to tell you that I don't have photos of McLaughlin or the ranch, so I want to get that disappointing note out of the way initially. Looked high and low for pictures of him, and I think something will turn up probably one of these days. He's probably in a group photo, one of the unnamed people next to somebody that we do know, but haven't found photos of him or the ranch yet. So one of the challenges of doing research on the Estes Valley, especially the southern Estes Valley, is there wasn't much there in the early days. This picture is taken from the slopes of Twin Sisters looking north in 1916. So this is quite a while after some of the stuff I'll be talking about, but still there wasn't much there. Thus I needed to expand, you know, my scope and work on some of the peripheral areas as well as the valley itself. In the early days of the valley, I'm talking around the late 1860s into the early 1870s, most of the action in the Estes Valley revolves around the Griff Evans Ranch. He, of course, acquired the ranch from Joel Estes after it passed through a couple other people's hands in 1867, and then continued to own the ranch until about 1878. A lot of people came through the valley, came to his ranch, stayed there, including Isabella Bird, but no one came and decided to settle down and have a ranch, form a ranch, until the pioneers of 1875 came in. That is, all except one person, and that was James McLaughlin. There was some prior research available on him. He was not a completely unknown commodity as far as historians go. It was known that he had a ranch in the Estes Valley. It was known that Griff Evans and James McLaughlin had a working relationship, and they both raised cattle. Also, McLaughlin raised potatoes and barley and experimented with timothy, which is a grain for cattle feed. It was known that he was born in 1825 from the records I saw, except further research, it was actually 1824. And he testified at the grand jury hearing on Dunraven's land grabbing homestead scheme, where Dunraven had some pseudo homesteaders that he brought in actually through his agent, Theodore White, to homestead, except they really weren't homesteading. They were just signing papers and turning the land over to Dunraven's company. When the jury came back, they didn't bring any indictments because the pseudo homesteaders had all disappeared. So that went for naught, and Dunraven got to keep his land. These notes here came from brief mentioning in Pickering's book, This Blue Hollow, and in a few other books, but it's always a brief mention in passing. So one of the first places I started to go to look for information about McLaughlin was Colorado Historic Newspapers collection. If you've never been out there looking through this resource, it's a wonderful resource, and you really should take a look at it. The Trail Gazette is out there from the beginning up through 1965, I believe now, and soon to be a few more years of digitized newspapers added out there. So here I'm doing a search on James McLaughlin, put his name in up here, and I limited it to Larimer County because it turns out there's quite a few James McLaughlins around, even back in the early days. I could have limited it also by date range. There's the website. So here's one of the hits that came back. This was from the Estes Park Trail in April 19th, 1935. And this is by Muriel McGregor. And she's looking back to her grandfather, Alexander McGregor, in the early days of his occupancy here in the valley, and kind of writing her reminiscence of that. And basically she says that in 1872, when my grandparents first came to the region, Estes Park was occupied by Griff J. Evans and James McLaughlin and was used as a stock range. Each knew his share by mutual agreement. My grandfather wrote in a report to a special agent of the Department of the Interior relative to land ownership in the region. Well, they might, because no survey had yet been done. So that's one thing you have to remember, is that at this early date, the valley had not yet been surveyed, which is a prerequisite for filing homestead. So it was open land at that time. James McLaughlin and Griff Evans were both termed squatters because they established their ranch and could not obtain title to it until after the survey had been done. Well, this is an example of one of the kinds of search results you can get. Also, I found Abner Sprague's stories out there. Now, other people have come across this before, but they were always looking for information about Rocky Mountain Jim and the relationship between Griff Evans and James McLaughlin. It was sort of an afterthought, but I went ahead and I found these again. What the important thing here is that James McLaughlin entered a quarter section joining the land on which he had his squatter's right, not on the land where he had where his buildings were. Entered means that he filed a homestead claim. And interestingly enough, it's not on the land where he had his buildings for his ranch. Well, why would that be? Well, it may very well be that by this time, and he did file the claim later on, I think in 1877, by that time, Dunraven probably acquired a lot of the land in the vicinity of the McLaughlin Ranch, including the land where the buildings sat. And so if James McLaughlin was going to make any money off of the land in the Estes Valley, he had to file on some land that hadn't been claimed yet. And that's what's going on here, I think. And it turns out that Griff Evans did the same thing. He had to file on land where his buildings actually were not located. And then another one of the reminiscences, these are from Abner Sprague's reminiscences back in 1822 in the trail, Estes Park Trail. So at the time of the trouble and for some time previous to the shooting, there had been stopping with Mountain Jim at a cabin on the McLaughlin Ranch, 2 miles up Fish Creek from the Evans home, a young man by the name of Brown, who was the only witness to the shootings. Okay, so for my purposes here, it's helping me narrow down where the ranch was, about 2 miles up Fish Creek. And that, again, was a good lead on where I needed to go. Then I turned to Ancestry.com for some more research. And it turns out James McLaughlin was born on October 7th, 1824 in Fairview Township, Butler County, Pennsylvania. His parents were Peter McLaughlin and Eleanor McDermott McLaughlin. And he was the oldest of 6 children. There were 4 boys and 2 girls. When you're using Ancestry, you have to be careful because people have the best of intentions when they do this work and put their notes and information out there, but it might not be correct. So I had to ask myself, is this the right James McLaughlin? Is the information provided correct? Other people seem to think so, but I can't really assume that. So the best thing to do is find multiple sources and make direct connections with your own research, which is what I did. So Peter McLaughlin, the father, served in the War of 1812 for 61 days. He established a 400-acre farm in 1816 via Pennsylvania land warrant, and this land warrant appears to not have been based on war service. It was simply land that the Pennsylvania state government wanted to disperse and make available to their settlers. He married Eleanor McDermott in 1821. They had the 6 children that I mentioned. Unfortunately, Peter McLaughlin died young in 1834 at the age of 40, leaving a widow with young children, and she's in her early 30s. Because he served at least 60 days in the War of 1812, much later on, Eleanor was able to get a war widow's pension of $8 per month in the 1870s, and I think that was eventually increased to $12 a month. So Eleanor continues to live on the family farm for the rest of her life. I think what happened is in the early years, there were a lot of McLaughlins around in Pennsylvania, and they probably got help from relatives, cousins, that kind of thing. And then as the kids got older, they tended to stay on the ranch or the farm and help out when they were old enough to do so. Well, this is the land warrant. I just decided to throw this in. This is in the Pennsylvania land warrant applications on Ancestry. It doesn't come out very well on this display, but you can see the name Peter McLaughlin, Butler County, 400 acres. And interestingly enough, he had to pay for this. I guess that's the difference between a land warrant that you might get through a war service and this type of warrant. He paid at the rate of $20 per 100 acres. So he had to pay $80 for his 400-acre farm, and it was in 1816. Okay, then I wanted to find the family farm, geographically. Where was this thing located? So the first thing to do is kind of get oriented to Pennsylvania here over in the corner. There's Butler County and there's Pittsburgh. So it's right north of Pittsburgh. And here's a map, an 1858 map of Butler County, and there's Fairview Township there. So then if you drill down on Fairview Township, you find that the McLaughlin farm is here. I have talked to researchers who live in the area out there, not anybody who directly in Fairview Township, but Butler County and in some of the other counties around there. They seem to think that there is an old farmhouse that belonged to the McLaughlins that's in that location. Of course, the land has been bought and sold and divided since 1858 many times, but it's one of the things I'd like to do if I have time is to go back and do some of the family research that you can really only do when you're on the scene. And by the way, the farm is identified as being in Fairview Township in the 1850 Federal Census. Okay, well, let's move forward a little bit and get a little more current here. At the age of 25, James McLaughlin is still living on the farm in 1850, according to the Federal Census. And all 6 children are listed too, so they're all there. However, in 1860, he's not listed on the census for the family farm, and he's not listed in any other 1860 Federal Census that I could find. As far as I can tell, he did not serve in the Civil War. I could not find him in any of those records. But he did move to the Estes Valley by 1870, and that's where things kind of get interesting. How do we know that? Well, here's the 1870 Federal Census for a portion of the Colorado Territory, Larimer County, Cache-la-Poudre District, so on and so forth. So here you have Griff Evans in the longhand script here and his family. And the person at the bottom here is McLaughlin, James, age 45, laborer from Pennsylvania. Okay, so this clicks. It fits just right in with what we're looking for. He did indeed come out, and evidently he stayed with Griff Evans when he first arrived here. Now this makes sense because McLaughlin was intending to set up a ranch, do cattle ranching. Griff Evans was already doing that. Griff Evans had extra cabins and such on his property, had other visitors. So it really made sense that he stay there. And other newspaper articles from that same era do show that they did work together and cooperate in a lot of their activities. Okay. So now I'm thinking, okay, McLaughlin filed a homestead claim. It's got to be here somewhere. And this handy document called Abstract of Title to Certain Lands in Larimer County owned and claimed by the Estes Park Company Limited of London, England. That, of course, is Dunraven's company. Okay, so this was produced in 1902 by Alfred Kearns in Denver, probably a lawyer. And what it is Dunraven is starting to think about selling all his land in the Estes Valley. And in order to do that, you have to establish that you really own the land. There were lots of battles over Dunraven's property, court battles, and sometimes he lost and sometimes he won. And so they needed to do this in order for anybody to buy the property. So in here are all the titles to all the property that Dunraven has, and in this document, and any land transactions leading up to when Dunraven acquired the property. And so this was ideal for my use. And by the way, Jim Pickering had the original on this, or at least the original of this copy that I had. And that was really handy. So I looked inside, and I did find James McLaughlin's entries in there. The first one is his homestead entry, which means his application for a homestead, and it has all the legal description of the property. Keep in mind that by this time of 1877, the whole valley had been surveyed. Well, most of the valley had been surveyed, and you could establish ownership over a particular piece of ground. The survey actually took place in 1874, or at least it was filed in early 1874. All right, so then the next thing is the granting of the patent, in other words, granting of the homestead rights to the property. And there are always, all these patents are always written the same way, United States of America to the person. And this was granted on January 25th, 1878, and filed on November 10th, 1879, which is really the time when a lot of the filings were done and McLaughlin was getting ready to leave the valley. Well, here it is. This is the first highlight, I guess. This is if you take the legal description that was on those previous documents, all this information here, and you plot it out, this is where the homestead was actually located. And since I was doing research on Carriage Hills, this fit right into what I was doing. So it overlaid on a modern map. Here's the Upper Scott Pond, Fish Creek over here, Highway 7, Mary's Lake. So you can get a pretty good idea of where this homestead was. Now recall that his buildings for his property, for his ranch, were not located in the homestead. They were somewhere else. So they might have been up here, here, down here, probably not over here, but I'll get into that in a minute. This whole valley in here is a pretty good place to have cattle too, because there's a natural drainage here that drains down to the Scott Ponds and then over to Fish Creek. So the grass in here is pretty lush. Would have been a good area for cattle raising. But as far as exactly where his buildings were, we don't know. If we could dig around there and people were allowing us to do that, we might find remnants of his ranch even today. Okay. Well, James McLaughlin had the audacity not only to, sell his property normally, but he had the audacity to sell a false claim to the English company, and Dunraven bought it. So this documents that James McLaughlin to the Estes Park Company Limited of London. Now, this warranty deed by itself doesn't look too suspicious. However, note that the person who was putting this together for the abstract of title, no title and grantor to the above described tract is found of record. And in a minute, I'll show you that that's because there was no title. So McLaughlin filed this false claim, and then shortly thereafter, he sold it to Dunraven for $3,500. Okay, here's the false claim, the land. And we can be pretty certain that McLaughlin's buildings weren't on this land, or he would have filed a homestead claim and then had his ranch buildings on his own land. But this was his false claim, legal description over here. And in a minute, I'll show you how he processed to sell the land. Oh, here's an aerial view of the Scott Ponds area, just to give you another idea of what it looks like. There's the lower Scott Pond that doesn't exist anymore. But this area here, I think, would have been good for cattle grazing. And on up here, it heads towards Gray Fox Estates and up toward Mary's Lake. All pretty good land, I think, for a ranch. So there's some logic to what he did. And Fish Creek then is over here. So when exactly did the ranch get established? Well, in this document here, James McLaughlin is giving a warranty deed, transferring the property to George W. Brown. And I'll talk about the reasons for that in a little bit. But the important thing here is that on this document, it says, being the premises known as the M. McLaughlin Ranch, and since the month of April AD 1871, occupied by the said first party in Estes Park in said county. So if this document is believable, this is when the ranch actually was established, making it the second ranch in the Estes Valley. So what did McLaughlin's ranch look like? Well, we don't have a picture of it, but my thought is it probably looked quite a bit like Griff Evans' ranch, in that there would have been a low log building, maybe an outbuilding or two, a fence for cattle and horses, and a lot of open land. Might not have been a pond. This was made by damming up Fish Creek for Griff Evans, but he was right on Fish Creek, and so probably didn't have the pond. And of course, Scott Ponds weren't there either. But I threw this in because I thought this might be a reasonable facsimile of what the ranch looked like. All right. Then I turned to the Bureau of Land Management General Land Office records. And out here, they have all the homestead patents for every homesteaded piece of property in the areas of the U.S. where homesteads took place. They also have surveys here, which are the original surveys of each township, all laid out with whatever markings they could find at that particular point in time, and some other documents as well. So I went in, put in Colorado, Larimer County, James McLaughlin, came back with this hit, and it does have James McLaughlin. It also has 2 other people on here, and I'll explain what that is. A lot of times when land was homesteaded in the West, they coupled it with a land warrant for somebody who served in a war. In this case, it was someone who served in the, James Moynihan served in the War of 1812. He died, and so it would be for his widow, Catherine Moynihan. And so what it amounts to is that if she wanted to exercise this land warrant, she could have come out here and claimed the land. But James Moynihan was in the Michigan militia, and she probably lived in Michigan, had no interest in coming out here. So the land was dealt with by establishing that the warrant had been taken care of, and now the land was available for homesteading. And so that's what's going on. That's why the extra names are on here. And here's all the legal description down here. Another thing this same website gives you is the ability to plot where the land is located. If you don't want to take your own public land survey map, and try to plot things out, you can use their tool here. And here I've got the first couple of components of it plotted here, and the others 2 would be down here. That was handy. Here's the McLaughlin Homestead patent. So this same Bureau of Land Management site has images of the patents, not for all of them, but for most of them. The first part of it deals with disposing of the land warrant that McLaughlin, that the Moynihans had, and moves on to assigning the land to James McLaughlin, and signed by our illustrious president, Rutherford B. Hayes. And on the 25th day of January, 1878. So that's when the document was signed. It's kind of neat to have those. If you have a relative who has, in their ancestors has homesteaded, why not look out here and get a copy of the land patent? All right. Then moving on. So James McLaughlin is not a young man when he moves out here. He's 45 years old already when he comes to the Griff Evans Ranch. And so within 2 years, he gets married. He didn't waste any time. There's some information, again, that comes from Ancestry. He married a Susan Black, age 32. So she was 15 years younger than him. And she was born in Ohio in 1840. There's no indication that they had any kind of connection before he moved out here. So by this time in 1872, he's been here 2 years, and he most likely would have met her out here, but we don't know for sure. And they had a son, just one son, Walter McLaughlin. He's born in 1876 in Nederland. I found their marriage license, but unfortunately I was pretty disappointed. If you could have a marriage license with very little or almost no information on it, this would qualify. Age unknown, race unknown. They got their names down here and the date, and that's about it. But at least there is a record out there. In a minute, I'll show you why we know that this Susan Black, who married this James McLaughlin, is the one who settled in the Estes Valley. Transfer of titles to McLaughlin's homestead. You have to kind of pay attention carefully here because this was a convoluted process. It's going to end up in the hands of the Estes Park company, Dunraven's company, but it went through some gyrations to get there. First of all, James McLaughlin filed his homestead claim January 22nd, 1877. Then he transfers the property to George W. Brown via warranty deed, the document we saw a little bit earlier. Why he did this isn't clear. Brown may have helped him get started on the ranch, and they're going to have some sort of maybe a financial arrangement later on after the final sale. I really don't know, but he certainly is helping James out here because then George Brown transfers title to Ada Douglas Cushman and to Mrs. Susan McLaughlin via quitclaim deeds, as shown here. Now, the fact that Mrs. Susan McLaughlin is involved in these transactions helps ensure that, we've got the right Susan McLaughlin, we've got the right James McLaughlin, and they did get married. So the next step, and all these final transactions happened at the November 10th, 1879. So Mrs. Susan McLaughlin transfers the title to the Estes Park Company Limited, and Ada Douglas Cushman transfers her portion to the Estes Park Company Limited, Dunraven's company, and they each received $3,500 for their share. James McLaughlin also sold his false claim to the Estes Park Company Limited at the same time for $3,500. Now, it turns out that this land that I showed you that was the false claim was actually homesteaded by a guy in a couple of years later, 1881. And he turned around and sold it to Dunraven's company. So Dunraven bought the same land twice. But the second time around, he only paid $500 for it, whereas this first time he paid $3,500. But I thought it was kind of interesting that this actually happened that way. And George Brown is Captain George Brown, one of Griff Evans' ranching partners. Okay, the next question. Who was this Ada Douglas Cushman? And that's on the next slide. All right. So she was born in 1846 and married young at the age of 16 to William Cushman, age 24, in 1862. There's a picture of him to the right. So William Cushman was an interesting character. He was a prominent citizen of Georgetown. He was one of the town fathers. He opened a bank. He made many loans to miners in the area. And but he was also, turns out to be an embezzler and a philanderer. His bank was having trouble. It's really hard to make loans to miners and know that you're going to get repaid, because some of the mines many of them turned out to have nothing. So you have a non-performing loan. Now you foreclose on the non-performing loan. Congratulations, you now own a mine that is useless. So he had some of these kind of problems, in addition to the fact that he was embezzling from the bank. He skipped town. He was a fugitive for a while. They eventually brought him back to face charges, but the charges were dropped because the records at the bank were all screwed up, and the feds couldn't come up with any good way to bring charges that would stick. So he got off free. The philanderer part, he had a woman on the side that he kept, which of course didn't sit too well with his wife, Ada. And by 1877, she was really operating on her own, making her own investments and so forth. And they were divorced in 1879. So her role here, starting a ranch takes capital, and Ada Cushman likely loaned money or invested in McLaughlin's ranch. Ada also bought another Estes Valley homestead and sold it to the Dunraven's interest. So she was, an additional activity in the area. And the other amazing connection here is that Rocky Mountain Jim sold his Mulligan's Gulch squatter's claim. I think I got that wrong, by the way, but that's okay. Squatter's claim to William H. Cushman in 1873, traveling to Georgetown to complete the sale. That was actually Mulligan's Gulch, I believe. Anyway, so this was documented in a book by David Hicks in 1976, Estes Park from the Beginning, I believe is what the title was. The fact that this transaction actually took place between William Cushman and Rocky Mountain Jim. So the Cushmans had some extended connection to the Estes Valley. Probably bears more research. All right, here's a township map, the original 1874 survey map of a portion of the Estes Valley. And it's actually Township 5 North, Range 72 West, 6 Principal Meridian, if you know what those things mean. It's a 6x6 land, meaning it's 6 miles this way and 6 miles this way. So it's 36 square miles. Each of these is a square mile, and they're numbered 1 through 36 like this across the diagram. or across the map until you get down to section 36. For my purposes, I was interested in this portion down here, which represents the Estes Valley that I'm interested in, and the town of Estes Park is also, or would the future town of Estes Park would be in this area. So here's a zoom in on that section of the map. And in 1874, they had the Evans settlement listed here, Fish Creek's here. And this thing is called the Wood Road for some reason. If you know where this goes through the central Estes Valley, you know, past Prospect Mountain over here and so forth, there's not much out here. There's not much wood to be had, but nevertheless, that's what the road's name was. There's other roads here. There's one that goes down toward Lyons. There's a road that goes up Dry Gulch. There's one that goes down along Fish Creek and joins up with the road that heads over to the McLaughlin Ranch and Mary's Lake. If you notice, they chose some unusual names for the rivers. Like here's the South Fork of Big Thompson Creek. The people who did the survey did the best they could, but they weren't really familiar with the objects and the things that are in the valley here. This is called I think it's the South Branch of Big Thompson Creek. South Branch now. Well, that's just Fish Creek. They did the best they could. Here is another survey, original survey map. Now this is diagonally to the left and below the township that I just showed you. And here is the McLaughlin Homestead. I'll show you a blow up of that on the next screen. There's the McLaughlin Homestead. Here's the continuation of that wood road. And here's Mary's Lake. At the time, they just called it Lake. And the next one has an even more detailed show. So McLaughlin's Homestead, remember his buildings for his ranch are not on this piece of ground here where he filed. So they could be over here. They could be down here. There's some interesting little dots down here that I haven't found anywhere else on the map. So maybe that had something to do with it, like some tilled land, perhaps. But the wood road continues on to Mary's Lake. And this is as much as we have. In a perfect world, there would have been a little spot here that says McLaughlin's Ranch or something, but it was not to be. All right, McLaughlin's certainly has some other aspects of his life that I wanted to look into. He leaves the Estes Valley in 1878. Now, he may have come back or through an attorney done the final sales of his property, but according to this Blue Hollow, he goes to Alpine, Colorado in 1878. And then by looking through Colorado historic newspapers, I see that he appears in Leadville in 1880 and then in Aspen, Colorado in 1880. And their arrival I wrote this, or included this little article here because it's really quite interesting. This is from the Rocky Mountain Sun, an Aspen newspaper in 1886. They're looking back on the time when the McLaughlins came to Aspen in 1880. So more than 6 years ago, in the early summer of 1880, Mr. and Mrs. McLaughlin, with their interesting little son, Walter, that's a really unusual way to describe him. They started from Leadville for the uninhabited and unexplored country of the Roaring Fork. Starting with pack animals, they followed the Eagle River down from its source to its confluence with the Roaring Fork. After much labor and great danger, they crossed this turbulent stream, overflowing its banks with melting snow of the mountains, and they followed up the Roaring Fork, crossed Castle Creek, and settled in the sagebrush of Aspen's Flat, where the Clarendon Hotel now stands. And it continues on the next page. Here, Mr. McLaughlin, with the aid of the few hardy pioneers who were then in Aspen, erected a good-sized tent. And here, Mrs. McLaughlin served the first meal that was ever cooked by a white woman in Pitkin County. It wasn't a dainty meal compared to what's now furnished at the Clarendon, but the prospectors who sat down to it considered it a meal fit for the gods. So this is their entry into Aspen. They've left the Estes Valley now and they've moved on to Aspen. I tried to find an old picture of Aspen. This one is from 1882. And you can still see that it's pretty small then. There's a few buildings here, and this is Aspen Mountain in behind. So what they did was they built their first hotel in Aspen. They first called it the Aspen House, and it was soon thereafter renamed the Clarendon. They built it in 1880, 1881, and they actually added on to it, and it burned down in 1884. So this is the first Clarendon hotel. Okay, now the second Clarendon, they decided to go a little bigger here, and this thing is a massive building. It stretches 215 feet along Mill Street, 100 feet along Durant Avenue, so roughly 21,000 square feet, and it's 3 stories high. It was a huge hotel, 90 rooms, a massive dining hall, billiards, salons, some other businesses who had shops along the base. Quite a hotel. It was by far the most prominent hotel in the town. Here's some ads from the Clarendon. Notice that in 1875, this is from a city directory. This is the only modern hotel in the camp. They called it the camp. But by 1888, now it's the first class hotel of the city of Aspen. So now we've upgraded ourselves to the city. Clarendon they would put on very festive banquets. If you just take a glance at this, I mean, their menu was incredible for these banquets that they had. So McLaughlin's activities in Aspen, the McLaughlins now, they built and rebuilt the Clarendon Hotel and ran it for 8 years. They owned land and houses in Aspen, other land and houses. They had financial interests in at least 16 silver mines. I lost count with some of all the land transfers and deed transfers. They owned a herd of dairy cattle. James McLaughlin was appointed and later elected to the town board. He was on the board of directors of the First Water and Light Company. And there were many lawsuits over mining interests that went on at the time. It was a great place to be a lawyer, and there were lots of them in Aspen. So one of the lawsuits over a lease to a mine went to the Colorado Supreme Court. And Susan McLaughlin was a partner in all these activities. Her name appears on a lot of titles, land transfers, and she basically ran the hotel while James did other things. Their son, Walter McLaughlin, went to grade school in Aspen. Okay, so this gets back to, how do I know that the James McLaughlin from Pennsylvania is the same one that I've been telling this story about? Well, it turns out that relatives of James McLaughlin came visiting in Aspen, and they were duly recorded in the newspaper in the social column. And one of them was this Stephen Rogers. So here's our James McLaughlin here. These are all his brothers and sisters, parents here. And Stephen Rogers, a nephew, came and visited them, and that was recorded in the records. Also, Eleanor McLaughlin Rogers, moved to Durango, and James went to visit her there. And I haven't shown it here, but Susan McLaughlin's relatives, several of them came to visit them while they were in Aspen. So all this ties together and helps to show that the James McLaughlin from Pennsylvania in the first part of this presentation is the same one that the story continues on here with that in Aspen. Actually, I have a picture. This is a picture of Stephen Rogers. So Aspen, I got a few pictures here of Aspen and Aspen Mountain in 1887. One guy looked at this picture recently and he said, wow, look at all the parking. Because if you've ever been to Aspen these days, there's not much parking. So this is William Henry Jackson, 1887. Now the mines, here's one of the mines that the McLaughlins owned with their partners. Most mines were owned by partnerships. And this is the Vallejo mine, also one of the ones involved in the lawsuit. And all the other mines are numbered here on a sheet that goes along with the picture. The mountainside looks kind of trashed out. And the next one, it really looks trashed out when you see the way the trees are. It looks very denuded. It looks like they've had a forest fire. But they weren't too concerned about the looks at the time. They were mostly concerned about the mining. And there's the Vallejo mine again. Well, times change. This is what Aspen Mountain looks like today. They turned in their silver mines, and they closed them up and discovered something even more lucrative, tourism and skiing. The Clarendon Hotel, if it existed today, would be right down here at the bottom of these ski lifts, and the Vallejo mine would be right up here. So it's just a way of showing how things change. Well, again, the McLaughlins weren't done. They sold the Clarendon Hotel to Jerome Wheeler in 1888 for $25,000. Now, Wheeler is the famous one of the Wheeler Opera House and the Jerome Hotel banking. He was one of the founding fathers of Aspen in the early days. So the McLaughlins sold out. They traveled for a couple of years, and they settled in Silver City, Utah in 1890. They ran the Paxman Hotel, and they built and ran the Tintic Hotel, which had 18 rooms. Also, James McLaughlin was postmaster from 1896 to 1901. And they, at the same time, they were buying and selling properties in Salt Lake City. But then the question is, why would they move to a place like Silver City when they had everything going for them in Aspen? Because here's a picture of Silver City in 1887, about 3 years before they moved there. There's not much, pretty rustic. A lot of mining going on in the area, but, kind of primitive. The only thing I can think of is that he still had the wanderlust. He wanted to go and try once again, to get into mining, which he did, and operate hotels, which they did. So they continued to do this. He's 64 years old at the time that they moved to Silver City. So Silver City, just a quick facts here, founded in 1869 in what's known as the Tintic Mining District. There's a cluster of towns in this one county where a lot of mining goes on. A lot of mining did go on. This was the second largest district for mining production in Utah. And for a while, for about 10 years, it was the largest. And of course, the population fluctuated as it does in many of these mining towns, according to the productivity of the nearby mines. In 1880, they were down to 5 businesses as mine production lagged, but there were new mines, new strikes in 1896, and some of the old mines also began producing again. This led to rapid growth, and the railroads reached the town, and they installed a smelter for processing the ore on site. Population peaked at 1,500 in 1908, so it was never a big town. But by the late 1930s, it's almost deserted, and today it is a ghost town. But the whole mining district, the Tintic Historic District, is on the National Register of Historic Places. And I'm hopeful that, out of either Silver City or Aspen, might end up finding some pictures of the McLaughlins, especially out of Aspen. Here's some pictures of Silver City. This one I always get a kick out of because it looks like a set for a Gunsmoke or some other Western movie, but this is how it looked in the earliest days. This is a bird's eye view of Silver City. So this is from a much later time, 1920s. This turns out to be a school here. This is a hotel. This is probably the Tintic Hotel, or if another one was built, it could be that, but it's probably the one that the McLaughlins ran at an earlier time, one of the mines over here. A group of early residents around a mine, or around a drill demonstration, I think is what's going on. A boarding house. It's possibly the McLaughlins ran this because they did run the hotel as well. A store from the 1920s. And this is 1909. So this is right around the time the population peaked. They had good railroad service into the Tintic Mining District. And this is a smelter that was installed to process ore on site. And so things were going pretty good at that point in time. Later, not so good. This is the school that I showed off in the distance in that other picture from the 1920s. Okay, time to wrap up here. So James McLaughlin continued working in area mines until 1901, and he's dying in 1902 at the age of 79. So at the age of 78, he was still working in mines. Son Walter McLaughlin was an assayer in Silver City in the late 1890s. And Walter then became a professor of civil engineering, actually, at Utah Agricultural College, later Utah State in Logan, Utah. Then he became an irrigation engineer and headed the irrigation department within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and he moved to Berkeley, California. He married Phoebe Eliasson in 1898, and they had a daughter, Anna. After James's death in 1902, Susan McLaughlin lived with Wesley and Phoebe McLaughlin in Berkeley, California, until her death in 1925. And they are buried in Salt Lake City. Of all the places they've been, and they did own property in Salt Lake City. For some reason, they chose this to be for their burial. Now, James McLaughlin, he has one final story here. He dies in Silver City, and he's buried in a nearby town called Eureka in 1902. However, he's also buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Salt Lake City in 1906. So they must have reinterred him there in 1906, because he definitely dies in 1902. There's a death certificate going with that. And then Susan McLaughlin lived to 1925, and here is her grave. There's one last thing here. This is an obituary for James McLaughlin. So it mentions that he was a postmaster in Silver City, but then it goes on to say Mr. McLaughlin was also proprietor of the Tintic Hotel at Silver City and had a large acquaintance among the mining men throughout the state, and will be sadly missed, and will sadly miss his genial countenance, etc. So he was widely known in the mining community, and I think that's true in Colorado as well as in Utah, and that's kind of his legacy. Here are resources that I used. I think I have some more that I actually used, but these are probably the main ones. First one I want to highlight is the Estes Park museum staff and online collection. Even though I didn't use any of their pictures in this one, in the book I'm writing on the history of Carriage Hills and the southern Estes Valley, I will definitely use some of their material. And Jessica, Michaela, and Derek are all very helpful and good resource if you're going to start doing some research. And then all these other sources listed here. I'd be happy to send links to these or answer any other questions now that you might have. So Michaela, I might turn this back over to you. And I don't hear you.
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of your research.
Oh yeah, I kind of got on a roll there, and I know we didn't have any questions while I was talking, but I hope people remembered and have anything that they might want to ask. Or
yeah, if anybody has a question now, go ahead and hit that raise hand button.
I still have a lot of loose ends in finding out more information about him, which I intend to continue to do.
Yeah, absolutely. What a wealth. Bob also has his email listed down below, and then you can find my contact information as well on the museum's website. We have a raised hand from Judy. Judy, let's see.
Okay.
There we go.
Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Okay. Yeah. Well, very, very interesting, Bob. I'm was kind of excited to see that evidently my house sits almost exactly in the middle of the ranch property. But my question is I had heard that there's a forthcoming book, and I'm wondering if you have any idea of when that might come out.
Yes, I really didn't mention it specifically, and I'm going to be talking with the museum here shortly. It's really almost done, but then if you know about writing a book, it's never done.
Yeah.
So I hope to wrap it up here soon, and it's going to be on Carriage Hill, history of Carriage Hills and the southern Estes Valley. This goes back to when I was saying, I first started looking at Carriage Hills and its history, but then I realized I had to expand. And so it really covers the southern Estes Valley. There isn't a whole lot written about that. And I thought that I could include some of the homes, the early homes in the area, and how the land actually transferred. It left the hands of Dunraven primarily and some other homesteaders, and ended up in places like Carriage Hills. So I traced that process too in the book.
So forthcoming.
Yes, the book is forthcoming soon, but we'll have to see how the publishing process goes.
Okay, look forward to it.
Thank you, Judy. We've got a couple of questions. Anita, I think I've gotcha. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Bob,
There you are.
Hello.
hi. I'm so happy you did this because I always wondered, I live in Rockwood Estates and I have a piece of paper, a photocopy, a grantee, Roland Hallock, and it's all the mining, agricultural, manufacturing, and other things to James McLaughlin. And it's dated April 15th, 1879. And now I know who he is.
Well,
Thank
that's wonderful. I'd like to see that document too.
It's just one piece of paper, but I don't know who Roland Hallock
Well,
was.
that name is familiar. I think he's one of the other homesteaders in the area.
Because I'd never heard of him, but this was great. So thank you so, so much. And if you, I think Michaela has my email. If
I do.
Okay. Yeah, we'll connect up on that. Rockwood Estates was developed at the same time that Carriage Hills, and some of the same real estate folks and developers were involved in both.
So this is exciting. And I got this piece of paper when I bought the lot. So as far as I know, it's still in effect.
Yeah, and it could be another piece of ground that hasn't come out in my research yet that McLaughlin owned.
Well, it says he just has the rights. I don't know if he owns the land.
Okay. Well, we'll get together and I'll take a look at that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Anita. All right, we've got a couple more. Dick Life.
Yes, Bob, very, very well done. Certainly, Sandra and I have certainly enjoyed this. A question, though, in terms of what is the difference between and the significance of warranty deeds and quitclaim deeds?
Okay, I'll give you my understanding of it, but a real estate lawyer might give you a more extensive answer. But a warranty deed transfers the property, and also you warrant that you own the property and that you are, legally transferring it to them. A quitclaim deed says basically, here you go, it's yours now, but I'm not making any particular claim to the validity of it. So quitclaim deeds are often done between family members, where you don't want to go through the extra rigmarole of a warranty deed. There may be some other extra expense involved and so on, but you often see quitclaim deeds between family members where it's not an arm's length transaction. And it does change the name on the title, which is sometimes what people want to have done.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Dick. Bob, are you doing okay? We've got just a couple more.
I'm fine.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, Dr. Pickering is with us. Jim, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Well, Bob, what a splendid lecture. It was just great. A couple of comments. One, first of all, I'm just delighted that you followed up, and now we know something more about James McLaughlin and a great deal more about that era of early Estes Park history. The other comment I wanted to make is you've been nice enough to let me read through the history of Carriage Hills, and let me tease everybody by saying that if you enjoyed this lecture and discovering new things about Estes Park, you're going to love this new book when it comes out. I learned lots of stuff about that part of the valley that I'd never known before. So Bob, thank you very much for your lecture and all your good work.
Well, thank you so much. And your payment will be in the mail.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been a real enjoyable time, and Jim has helped me. He's a good mentor. We drove around different times and looked at places where, properties are or properties were, and he answered questions back when we could still get together and drink coffee before COVID. It was nice to meet you, Jim, and nice to work with you.
Awesome. All right, last one. Neil, are you there? Possibly.
Neil Standard?
I think so. Let's see if he's there. He had his hand raised. But maybe not. Maybe we lost Neil.
Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Hi, Neil.
Oh, I've been pressing buttons all over the place. That's my method of doing the computers. I just start pressing buttons till something happens. Bob, very interesting. And congratulations on your research and so forth. You said, I didn't know that he was involved in mining. Did you mention?
Yeah,
Do you
that
have
was
any
that was a
Go
big
ahead.
part of his. Once he left the Estes Valley and he went to Aspen. Well, he first stopped in Leadville, but it's obvious that mining was one of his big things he wanted to get into. And if you remember, he was still, traipsing around in mines at the age of 78 when he was down in Silver City. So it was
Yeah.
definitely in his blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you check with Gilpin County on him, his name?
No, I did not check with them. I've looked, the state, well, the Denver Public Library has a copy of, mining information survey for the entire state. Haven't found him in there.
Yeah.
But I had no indication that he went to Gilpin County. He seemed to have gone right from Leadville down to Aspen.
Uh-huh. Do you know how old was he when he first appears, when you first learn of him, or when he was here?
So-
How old would he have been?
Well, when he first came to the Estes Valley, he was 45.
45.
We
Okay.
have that in the,
Well-
well, I should say that's the 1870 census. Now, he might have been here
Yeah.
a little before that because we don't have the 1860 census. We know he left the farm or left the ranch, farm back in Pennsylvania. But we're not sure where he went for those, those years in between.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna, with your permission, I'm sure I'll have your permission. I'll contact the curator for Gilpin County Historical Society, Davis, still talk to him and so forth, and see if there's any record of him in Gilpin County. It would surprise me if there wasn't. A lot of the people that failed at mining in Gilpin County did come to this area and tried farming, not to this area, to the Front Range. But I just if he was involved with mining, I'd be very surprised if he wasn't at least walking down the main street of Central City at some point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a likely scenario because after 1859, a lot of people showed up and tried their luck and it didn't work. And then they moved on to other places, but we really don't know much about McLaughlin's activities around between 1850 and 1870. He might have been in Gilpin County.
Yeah. If he was involved in mining at all, he may have had contact with Henry Teller, and because Henry Teller represented lots of mine. Henry Teller came here in 1860 and stayed at the Estes Ranch and so forth. And yeah, I'll follow up for you and see if we find out anything.
And the connection to George Cushman in Georgetown is also interesting too, and the fact that Rocky Mountain Jim also had that connection, and then the Ada Douglas Cushman, his wife, was involved in his transaction. So there's something going on there too that probably needs further investigation.
Yeah, the name Cushman is real vaguely familiar for some reason. I studied a lot about the history of Georgetown because of the railroad, the Colorado Central Railroad going up to Georgetown and so forth. and have spent many an hour traipsing the streets of Georgetown, going to their museum and so forth. So anyway, yeah, I'll follow up for you and let you know if I find
Okay,
anything.
that would be great. One of the fun things about doing research like this is that people come up with ideas, or, you know, when I come out with a book, I'm sure there's going to be people that have old time stories that they have, or that they've heard, that they would like to, you know, throw my way. So that might mean that I have to do a revised version after the first version.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be something if we find out he had some mines and all that stuff in Gilpin County? That'd be,
It would. I'm thinking
Yeah.
about publishing this part just about James McLaughlin as a separate essay, and then it could have different, you know, versions. Especially, there's a lot. I need to go to Aspen because he was a prominent person there, and you know, that's where I hope to find some photos. But I've worked with the Aspen Historical Society, but everybody's working remotely now, so it's kind of hard to get,
Mhm.
you know, dig in and find stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Neil.
Mhm.
All right, well, with that, I think that is all the questions I see, or at least all the hands raised. So we'll close it out here. I just want to mention quickly that the next museum program is a meeting of the 1917 Book Club, Wednesday at 10 a.m. or Wednesday, April 21st at 10 a.m. And we are reading Fred Payne Clotworthy, Colorado's Color Photography Pioneer by Rochelle Cross Forge. So if you want to join us then, please do so. All of those links again are on our website. Bob, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Enjoy
And
it.
yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks again.
Okay. Bye-bye.